All right, everybody. We've got around to time for the lecture to begin. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Kershaw, who's going to give us tonight's lecture. Jane is an associate professor in the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford, and she's had a JRF, a Junior Research Fellowship at Balliol, Oxford. The last time I heard, there were about 300 applicants for each of these fellowships. So, you know, then a British Academy postdoc and also a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship leading up to this current post. Jane has a project at the moment, an ERC, European Research Council project on Viking silver. We're going to hear something about that tonight. There's a project website, and the project's titled Silver and the Origins of the Viking Age, circa 750 to circa 1050. So that's worth looking up, folks. She's edited a volume, Silver, Butter, Cloth, with Gareth Williams, and she has a forthcoming article in Antiquity on Arabic silver in the early Islamic period, so from the beginning of the 8th century to the beginning of the 10th. In general, Jane works on Viking Age, early medieval and Viking Age archaeology, and on Scandinavian settlement in Britain, and a number of other things too. We're going to hear about some of this work anyway, so I'd like to invite Jane to come up now and give her lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. Is that better? That's better. Thank you for braving the strikes and coming out this evening. I want to talk about Viking silver. The Vikings and silver go hand in hand. The Viking Age is often described as a silver age because it's characterized by many hoards of silver, hoards like this one you see here from Bedell in North Yorkshire, and also lots of settlement finds of silver. So artifacts like ingots, hack silver, jewellery, arm rings especially, all in different states of preservation. And this silver gives a very strong visual impression about the great wealth resources accumulated by the Vikings in the period 800 to 1000. And there's been a lot of study. Over 100 years, people have studied Viking silver. And they've studied it in different ways to give very, very sound and reliable insights into this period. People have used Viking silver to study typologies, which is useful for dating. It means we can trace different the travel of different cultural styles and ideas. People have also used silver to look at economic development, and they've looked at the degree of silver fragmentation as an index to economic development. Items like the Vale of York hoard, found near Harrogate in 2007, also provide something of a snapshot of the cultural world of the Vikings. We have artifacts from the Irish Sea region, from Scandinavia, coins that the Vikings minted themselves, Islamic silver coins, dirhams, all contained within this Carolingian silver cup. So all these approaches are very useful for thinking about the Viking Age. But what I want to do this evening is take a different, a new approach to silver and ask, where does it come from? And to do that, I'm going to talk about some recent geochemical work that we've been doing on Viking silver hoards from across the Viking world, as people call it. And identifying the source of silver is important for understanding the very nature of the early Viking Age. And I think the early Viking Age, as we know it, has a number of kind of features that you will probably recognize. We tend to think of it starting in 793 with the Viking attack on Lindisfarne, and it's seen as very much an extension westwards out of Scandinavia. the primary economic activity seems to be raids on the coast of Britain, on the continent, and on Ireland. These raids escalate during the 9th century before we see a period of settlement. And it's clear from the written sources that silver and other forms of portable wealth is one of the main drivers, the main goals of these raids. But in addition to this western expansion, we also have an expansion eastwards across the Baltic towards modern-day Russia. And this is an expansion based not on loot, not on raiding as such, but on trade, what you might call muscular trade, because it's not entirely free from force. Now, at the moment, this eastern expansion is seen as a later development, taking place in the second part of the 9th century and really reaching its height after 900. It's not really part of the very beginnings of the Viking Age as we understand it. So what I want to do today is to use silver to kind of challenge some of those traditional narratives. I'm going to be looking at 9th century silver from Scandinavia as well as from areas in the west that the Vikings settled. And I'll use some techniques from geochemistry to look at its provenance. And I'm going to suggest that, in fact, the amount of silver said to have come from the west has been greatly exaggerated by the written sources, that is. The main source of silver, I think, is Islamic and comes from the Eastern trade network. And I want to put forward an argument that this silver arrives in Scandinavia at a much earlier date than we think, not after 900, not in the late 9th century, but already from 800. I think there's a sizable influx of dirhams, of Islamic silver, reaching Scandinavia at this very early stage, and that actually expansion in the east is something we should think about as one of the main characteristics of the early Viking Age. So this is the story of the talk. So the work I'm going to be talking about comes from an ERC project I got about 4 years ago now. So we've got another year and a bit to run, so it's a really good stage to give an overview of the results. In addition to myself, it involves Stephen Merkel, who's a fantastic archaeometallurgist who has done a lot of the metallurgical work, as well as Yanni Oravicievi, who's a specialist in Islamic dirhams. Very rare skill set to have to be able to read, identify Islamic dirhams. So we are a kind of interdisciplinary team, and we need to be in order to approach a question like this, I think. So, a bit of background then. What are the possible silver sources that the Vikings could have been using? So silver is available in Scandinavia, we know today, but in the Viking Age, no silver was mined, so it all had to be imported. And we think it comes from one of two sources. The first is Western Europe. And that's because documentary sources tell us that the earliest raids were focused here, with attacks on Britain, Ireland, the continent. I mean, you can see all these red arrows going across all these hits with the yellow and orange dots. And the narrative sources are very clear that the amount of silver acquired on these raids was really large. We hear of 6,000 pounds of silver given to Vikings on the Loire in 862, 5,000 pounds to those on the Seine in 866, and the numbers go up and up. By the 880s, in West Francia, 12,000 pounds of silver are extracted. And one estimate, just based on the written sources, is that this is something like 7 million pennies overall, which one scholar estimated was about 14% of the wealth of the Carolingian Empire. The Anglo-Saxon sources are a little bit more circumspect. They don't really talk about money in those terms, but it's clear that wealth was also one of the main motives for raids there. And the other source of silver that we have is an Eastern one, meaning silver coming from the Islamic Caliphate. So the Vikings develop riverine trading routes from the east, down the river Dnieper, and down the Volga, and they establish kind of fortified trading settlements along these routes, places like Ladoga, Novgorod, Gnezdovo, and here and in prominent markets such as Bulgar and Itil, seen here by the Caspian, they're trading slaves, furs, other commodities brought from the north for Islamic dirhams. We know this because there are so many of these dirhams that survive in the archaeological record. We have around 400,000 that have been found in Scandinavia and the Baltic region. And that's just going to be a small fraction of the numbers that originally reached Scandinavia. The issue is most of these dirhams come from contexts that are late 9th century and especially dating to the 10th century. They account for the majority of those coins. And so people generally say that in the 9th century it starts off, the dirham flow is really only a trickle, and it only becomes a flood after 900. So the question I wanted to address was, what is the relative contribution of these two sources of silver, an Eastern and a Western source? Well, we have the coins themselves. That's one indicator. But actually, it's a bit problematic. We have loads of these dirhams surviving, but we don't have many Western European coins at all. In fact, from the estimate of 7 million pennies, we have just 200 Carolingian coins from Viking Age Scandinavia. So that's nothing. There's around 10 or 12 Anglo-Saxon coins, so really tiny numbers. And that reflects probably the fact that the Vikings don't always keep coins as coins. They treat them as a source of bullion, and they use them, they melt it down, and they cast it into artifacts that have cultural meaning for them. Ingots that act as a store of wealth and can be fashioned into rings, and various forms of neck and arm rings. And when this happens, it obscures the original source of the silver. How do I know what silver made up this ingot? So we need a new approach, and that is one that uses lead isotopes in combination with trace elements. So lead isotopes are measuring the isotopes of the lead that occurs naturally in the silver. This is ideal circumstances. And normally, Viking Age silver will contain about 0.5% to 2% lead. Trace elements, we're looking at things like gold and bismuth, which should relate to the original metal because they survive the remelting process. There are some issues to be aware of when using this method. One is that this silver is absolutely recycled and likely to be made of multiple sources. No massive Viking neck ring is made from a single dirham. It's impossible. Indeed, a ring like this weighing some 250 grams is going to be made of around 85 dirhams, an even greater number, 170 or so Western European coin, and indeed it could be made of a mix of those two different sources. So we have to kind of take into account and model for the fact that silver is going to be recycled. This is especially important for dirhams, Islamic coins, because they come from such a wide variety of places, geographically speaking, that they're going to have very different lead isotope results. And the other thing that we need to be aware of is cupellation. So when you refine silver to raise its silver level, silver fineness, you do that by adding lead to the mixture, heating the mixture up. The lead forms a litharge that draws away the impurities of the silver, and you're left with pure silver, or almost pure silver behind. And when you do that, the isotope results you get from analysing that silver, they don't belong to the silver itself, they belong to the lead that you added in. And so it's not going to bear any relation to the sources of silver. This can be a real barrier to provenancing, but fortunately, it doesn't appear to have been common in the Viking Age, probably because the Islamic dirhams are already 98% silver, really high levels of silver. You don't need to refine them, and you're not going to do refining unless you absolutely have to. But we do need to be aware of it, and we are very keen to look for local leads and look at the isotopes of local lead to evaluate whether the silver is being refined or not. Okay, so what did we do? Well, the first step was to build a reference database. And we knew already that there were these two sources of silver, and we knew that they were going to be different, simply because there's different geologies underlying what is today England and Northwest Europe versus the Middle East, Near East, Central Asia. But we also needed to increase the number of artifacts that we had in our reference data set. So the first thing we did was to analyse over 100 early Islamic dirhams, so minted between 700 and 900. So these coins are fascinating because they're minted from Spain, northern Africa, all the way through to kind of what is today Iraq, Iran, and through to Central Asia. So they span an enormous area. And these coins circulated freely across borders. So when they were exported to Scandinavia, you get a real mix of coins in these hoards. So you might have a Viking hoard with ingots, and you might have Umayyad dirhams, Abbasid dirhams from Baghdad. You might have a couple of Central Asian dirhams. They're all a complete mix. And so we needed to take this into account and model for this when we were looking for our Viking sources. So the red dots on this map are the mints that we sampled coins from. So we tried to encapsulate this in our sampling program. Just as an aside, what we were also able to do was to compare the results of these coins with local ore sources and suggest some areas of Islamic mining. This is something that hasn't been done from an archaeological or a kind of scientific perspective before, and it's normally thought that lots of mining occurred in Arabia and also Central Asia. But we found that that wasn't really the case, and we proposed a much more regional mining system. There were mines in North Africa. There were mines at the borders of the Islamic and Byzantine empires in the Taurus Mountains. There are lots of mines in Iran, and there's also mining in Central Asia. And this is the topic of the antiquity paper that was mentioned in the introduction. Just as an aside, and I think the good thing about having a research project is you have the freedom to pursue these sorts of things when they come up. So that was a happy distraction for us for a while. But back to the dirhams. So we had these dirhams analysed, but we wanted to answer the question, well, what do these dirhams look like if they're all melted down together? We're not interested in individual coins, we're interested in the mix. So what we did was that we looked at 12 hoards from the Baltic island of Gotland, and we looked at the dirham contents of those hoards, and we matched the coins in terms of mint and date with the coins that we actually analysed in our data set. And we created a model, which you can see here. This is the graph with the dots in green. These answer the questions. If all the dirhams in the hoard from Visby were melted down, what would their lead isotopes be? If all the coins in the hoard from Oxar were melted down, what would their lead isotopes be? So it's a model, not individual coin analyses, but it's based on a much larger analytical data set. And we found out that these coins, there's a really interesting chronological dimension here, which proves to be quite important. Over time, the isotopes of the hoards shift. So early on, in the dark green, these ones, these are hoards that all date to before 840, TPQs of before 840. But as the 9th century goes on, the isotopes shift and you get slightly higher ratios. And this reflects the fact that dirham composition changes over time. So you have, as time goes on, you have fewer Umayyad coins, fewer Sasanian coins, increased numbers of coins coming from Baghdad, which is the major Abbasid mint, increase of coins coming from Central Asia, and that affects the mix that we see. So that was our work on dirham. It's a little bit involved, I appreciate, but it's important for some of the results I'll discuss. And alongside dirhams, we also analysed Anglo-Saxon coins of the 9th century. Here they are in a little tray, and I'll explain this method in a moment. We analysed Carolingian coins of the 9th century, and we were also very lucky to get some data from colleagues in Orleans relating to Western Carolingian coinage as well. These coins, they don't have the same geographic breadth that the dirhams do, so we didn't feel the need to model them in the same way. We could just analyse the coin and then plot that on the map. And when we did that, we come up with this pattern. So fortunately, Western European coins, seen here in purple, 1 dot equals 1 coin, have a different lead isotope signature to the dirham hoard models that we created. So this is our reference data. You'll be very bored with it by the end of the talk. But it's not just lead isotopes that we did. We also looked at gold and bismuth. And as I mentioned, these survive the remelting process. So in principle, if you have an ingot and it's melted down and made into an arm ring, the gold and bismuth contents are going to stay the same. If you mix it with silver from another source, they'll change. But they're very useful for us. And the broad patterns are that Islamic silver has much less gold less gold than Western European silver. And the bismuth contents are different too. Islamic coinage has higher bismuth than Western coinage does. So it's really using the isotopes and the trace elements in combination that gives us a more robust approach. Okay, so that was our work kind of building up the reference dataset, which was in itself a lot of fun and some new conclusions to make. But we then set about analysing the Viking artefacts themselves. And this has been super fun because we've gone to Sweden, we've gone to Denmark, we've gone to, these were in Orleans, and there's hoards as well from England and Scotland that we've also analysed. So a wide range of different hoards. And I also wanted to put these red triangles on here because these are the labs. So it's not just a story about archaeological science, it's also about forming human collaborations because each kind of analysis involves setting up a lab, normally in the country where the artifacts are because you're not allowed to take them out of the country. It means sharing our standards, our precise methods, forming collaborations between the labs and the local museum where the artifacts are kept, agreeing the publication. You know, it's quite an involved process. And these are not archaeology departments. These are mostly earth science departments, if they're in universities. Sometimes they're more commercial. So we've had to kind of talk to a lot of people, have a lot of collaborations, which has been really good. We analysed this material in 2 different ways. Where we're allowed to sample physically, we did. We're taking really tiny samples, though, 0.01 grams, which is, I don't know if you can see it, but that's this amount in the file, so it's super small. This is an ingot from the Bedale Horde, and I don't know if you can see where we sampled it from. Happily, ingots tend to have lots of pitted surfaces, and so it's sort of hidden. But this was that's where we sampled it from, which gave us that. That is plenty for both lead isotope and trace element analysis. And we're using really small drill bits, and it's because we're not taking very much that we got a lot of the permissions that we needed from the museums. If we're not given permission, and sometimes museums just have a blanket policy, then we use laser ablation. We put the objects in a tray like this. They're normally quite small, like 10 by 10, and just 2 or 3 centimeters high. So you can't do massive arm rings, for instance, but coins are great, hack silver's great. And they go into a laser ablation chamber. The material is ablated, it's sucked up into a vacuum, and it goes into the mass spectrometer. We're also working with a lab in Amsterdam, and we're developing a kind of hybrid system, which is a laser where the material then gets stuck to Teflon filters, and you can then put that in a solution and analyze it as you would do a physical sample. The benefit of solution is that it gives you more accurate results than a laser would. But the benefit of the laser is that it's less destructive. This is what you would call minimally destructive because you can't see it with the human eye. So we're trying to develop a method that kind of satisfies both of those requirements. Okay, so onto the results. I have 5 results, and we'll do a little tour of the Viking world. That's quite a lot of results, but I want to highlight 3 major takeaways. One is that we see a majority Islamic contribution in most areas, apart from the very far western areas. Also, that we can tell that this silver is early. This Islamic silver is coming in the first half of the 9th century. And this goes back to those early dirham hoard models that I spoke about. And I also want to talk about Western silver. Where it is present, and it absolutely is, it's not in the quantities we would expect. Okay, so let's start off in the East. And this is where silver from the East would have entered Scandinavia, across the Baltic, coming in here, arriving on the island of Gotland, which has so many silver hoards. It really is a silver hub. We analysed 2 hoards from Gotland and 1 from Irland. Here's some of the artifacts that we analysed, just the ones with the arrows, and we did this by laser ablation. And perhaps not surprisingly, given its location, we found that the cast silver items we analysed were made of Islamic silver, entirely Islamic silver. There's no Western element here. They sit quite nicely on our reference database. But what's interesting is where they sit. They don't fill the whole range. We don't see them up here at all. They very much sit in this early group, this pre-840 modelled data. But the silver that we analysed, it doesn't date to this early period. It dates to the late 9th and early 10th century. So I would have expected the silver to sit up here. What this indicates is that silver in these late 9th, early 10th century artifacts looks like dirham silver that arrived in Scandinavia before 840. These artifacts are part of large hoards that contain big, chunky arm rings and ingots. And if they're representative, assuming they're representative, this suggests that there's a lot of silver matching early dirham compositions. Now, in this period, in the early 9th century, we don't get very many actual dirham coins in Scandinavia. We get some, but they're not very common, and that's why people describe the inflow of Islamic silver as more of a trickle in this early period. But what this data suggests is that the dirhams are arriving in Scandinavia, but they're being melted down and cast into artifacts that make sense in a Scandinavian cultural setting. So the geochemical data is telling us something that we can't see archaeologically, about an early and a sizable influx of dirhams in the early 9th century, before the Eastern trade routes are meant to have been fully developed. And interestingly, this isn't the only place that we see this early dirham signature. So moving further south, we also looked at items from Denmark. And Denmark is positioned right in the middle of East and West. So we thought probably it's going to have a mix of maybe equal ratios of Western and Eastern silver coming in. We didn't analyze hoards. In this case, we analyzed hack silver from rural settlements in Denmark, but that we knew through typologies would be dated to the 9th century, and that also had evidence for 9th century coins from these settlements. So we don't have specific dates for these, for these items. But the results showed that, again, we see this early Islamic component, so stressing the importance of silver arriving in Scandinavia before 840. So the yellow triangles is the Denmark data. There's a real cluster here. We do also have some Western components here sitting on the purple dots. And this is very interesting because we haven't seen this before. We only have these 200 Carolingian coins from Scandinavia. And there's always been a question, well, what happened to the loot that they are said to have acquired? Part of the answer is that it's being melted down into ingots and rings and used within Scandinavia. Some of the accounts do say that the loot was transported back to Scandinavia. So we hear of the Vikings Siegfried and Gorm transporting 200 ships back to their country loaded with treasure and captives in the 880s, for instance. And it's kind of been seen as a curiosity that we don't have much surviving Carolingian coins. And I think part of the answer we can see now is that they were melted down. But it's not massive quantities. I would say here we're talking about 2/3 Islamic, 1/3 Western silver. Okay, moving to England. And this is where I want to talk about the Bedale Horde specifically, which is representative of other hoards from England that we've analysed. Bedale Horde is located here. And I thought when we started to analyse this hoard, well, surely it's going to be mostly Anglo-Saxon. Deposited around 900. The Vikings have been settled in England for at least 25 years. The Vikings are meant to invade a country and take wealth out. So the expectation was that this was going to be a majority Western silver collection. Here it is again. But in fact, that was not the case. We're seeing that this hoard in a Western Viking context is actually made with a majority of Islamic silver. There's a couple of other things going on as well. So here we see the Islamic silver, and we're not just seeing this early component, but we're also seeing later Islamic components. We also have a Western contribution and a couple of other things going on as well, which is a bit clearer if I show it like this. So the Islamic component, a Western component, possibly a mixture of the two. We have some items clustering in the middle, which could be both sources being mixed down together. And we also have, for the first time, lead appearing. Lead from England matches a couple of these artifacts, which also have a very clean elemental profile, which suggests that they've been refined with local lead. So in this case, the source of the silver is completely unknown. We can't tell because of the cupellation process, but we can see that that lead is being used and that lead is English. I also wanted to bring in the trace elements here. I haven't spoken about them very much, but if you remember, the gold and the bismuth are quite important because these survive the recycling processes. We see that groups identified as Islamic on the basis of the lead isotope results also have the lowest gold and the highest bismuth. So this is the group in blue. And the other groups identified on the basis of the lead isotope results also match, or they fit where you would expect. Here, the grey dots represent the Western components. So the trace elements and the lead isotope results are mapping onto each other very nicely. Okay, so I want to head south before we end up in the Irish Sea. We've analysed, again, 2 hoards here, both found within the Carolingian Empire, probably deposited by Viking groups who were active in the region. Probably they've settled in the region in the late 9th century. So in terms of historical setting, we're not very different from the hoards from England. That both sets of hoards are found in Western Viking settlements. But actually, the silver's really different. So these are the 2 hoards that we've analysed, one from Westerkleef in the Netherlands and one from Normandy. Both hoards have an Islamic component. It's late, it's up here, but it's small, in just a few artifacts. Instead, what's really striking is that it seems to have been made up mostly of Western silver. Artifacts in this group include ingots as well as rings, meaning that the Scandinavians have acquired silver locally and melted it down to cast Scandinavian-type artifacts outside of the Scandinavian homelands. The impression that these hoards give is that these are Viking groups who are local, who are taking local wealth, turning it into ingots and rings. So you can kind of contrast this with the Islamic silver that's flowing in from the Baltic. It's spread out to Denmark and to England. Here we have a much more localized and restricted picture of silver use. Okay, well, I've saved the best till last. You will no doubt have seen pictures of the Galloway Horde, which recently came to light, astonishing collection of Viking silver and Anglo-Saxon silver, all contained within an incredible Sasanian vessel. Here are some of the items. We've got an Anglo-Saxon, a series of Anglo-Saxon brooches, a lovely gold bird pin, these true Hiddle-style hinges. There's also incredible beads. This is a Scandinavian annular arm ring. Amazing collection of items found in Galloway, in the south of Scotland. And again, probably deposited around 900, a little bit unclear. And I want to talk specifically about 2 types of silver that were found in the hoard. Particularly, these are ingots and a type of arm ring that's known as the Hiberno-Scandinavian broadband arm ring. Hiberno-Scandinavian because it was made in Viking Ireland, probably produced in Dublin. We analysed all the silver from this hoard. And you can tell, there's just a mass of these artifacts. But they're a really good proxy for understanding silver in the Irish Sea region because of their Dublin place of manufacture. And the silver in this hoard is really different. It's different to any of the silver we've looked at before. We found that the silver looks very Western. And actually, I haven't done this so far in the talk, but if we separate Continental silver from Anglo-Saxon silver, we can see that the silver specifically looks very Anglo-Saxon. There's this overlap here. I've removed the Continental coins and I've just left the Anglo-Saxon coins. And we have this big cluster of artifacts that sits very nicely with the Anglo-Saxon coins. But that's not the only thing going on. We see much more evidence for refining silver, for cupellation here, than we have done in other hoards. And this is what the grey dots indicate. This is English lead from Derbyshire. And I think this whole group of artifacts are candidates for being, these are artifacts whose silver has been cupelled and who are therefore returning isotope results that correlate with lead. And there's one final thing that's strange about the Galloway Horde, and that is the gold contents. They're really high. Normally, you wouldn't expect to get more than 1.5% gold. In this case, we're seeing 12%, I think this is 8% here. All of this group has elevated gold contents. Now, gold is much more valuable than silver, and you would normally try to take care to separate them. You don't really want gold going into your silver. But this suggests, these levels are so high that it suggests the recycling of silver that's been gilded or silver that has gold inlays in it. And if we think about the Galloway Horde items like the true Hiddle style hinge, like the gold bird pin, you know, there are definitely elements of that silver that contain gold that might explain an erratic but sometimes high gold content like we see in Galloway. But why do that? Why not take care to make sure gold doesn't get into your silver? Well, this would happen if you did this in a hurry. And so the fact that the silver looks very Anglo-Saxon, it looks like it's been cast in a rush, and it looks like whoever cast this is using not just coins, but high-status metalwork, plates that's been gilded. This, to me, looks very much like the recycling of high-status ecclesiastical or secular metalwork. And I think it looks like loot, that the Vikings have obtained this during their raids in England, and it's being deposited in Galloway. So how does this all fit together? And I appreciate that's a kind of very fast-paced tour through some different regions. But I think the emphasis on the Eastern silver is important because it suggests that we've underestimated the depth of the Eastern trade links in the 9th century. The dirham content models, compared to the analysed artefacts, allow us to identify a significant influx of dirham silver reaching Scandinavia, an influx that was quickly melted down, made into artefacts, and so leaves no archaeological trace. The fact that we see this signature not just on Gotland, but in Denmark and in England, indicates that it's a sizable import of silver. So Eastern trade links that we normally see as being a feature of the later 9th and the 10th century, I think, happened much earlier on, which means that silver-generating activity, slave trading, trading in furs, other northern commodities such as wax and honey, we hear they're trading swords, I think all this operated on a much larger scale from around 800 than is commonly assumed. Whether this Eastern trading route developed as early as 793 and the first Western raids that we hear about is kind of difficult to prove, but at the very least, the Eastern and the Western expansions are happening in parallel. We tend to look to the Viking expansion in the West as the key defining characteristic of the Viking Age, but I think we need to be looking eastwards. And I think there's an implication of this, which is because the Eastern route is based on trade, or muscular trades, rather than just simple raiding, this kind of shifts perceptions of the kinds of activities the Vikings were involved with. They're not just lone raiders who are kind of seeking out the nearest available wealthy sources, but they're also actors in rather complex trade networks that link the economies of Northern Europe with those of Western Asia. Silver from the West is certainly present, and we see that local groups, perhaps settled groups who are extracting wealth from the Carolingian Empire and from England, are melting it down and making it into artifacts. But the amount of this wealth is small overall. There are only, we looked at 2 hoards from the continent, well, there are only 3. So even if all that silver was Carolingian, it still doesn't add up to very much. It's a far cry from the 7 million pennies that the sources say ended up in Viking hands. But if the existence of the raids in itself is not in question, I'm not saying there were no raids, but I do wonder if perhaps the objective wasn't silver, perhaps it was other things like cattle or people or things like salt that could be traded for silver or just simply used, but that these things were given a value in silver in the annals. Or and I think this is possible, that the results, they're just exaggerated. It wasn't this amount of money that the Viking raids extracted, and perhaps the impact of the raids wasn't as bad as we tend to think. But I hope that approaching the Viking Age through silver allows us to see the Eastern and Western movements not as chronologically distinct and unrelated phenomenon, but as somehow linked, somehow complementary. They're certainly linked, I think, in terms of chronology and in terms of material gain, although the kind of methods for acquiring that silver do vary. So the next stage of our research is to judge from the dates of the surviving dirhams whether dips in silver coming from the east actually motivate raids from the west. So somehow, I want to explore whether there's a causal link between the inflows of silver that could account for increased raiding activity in the west. I suspect that is the case. For now, though, I propose that the profitability of the eastern trade routes was a far more significant driver of the Viking Age than currently envisaged. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. It's a fascinating talk about a topic which I imagine few of us know very much, and we know a great deal more than we did an hour ago. I want to call for questions, please. Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask? Martin.
I think it's an absolutely fascinating talk, and I think it really opens up partly a new field. Of course, there's also been work on an earlier period on the Hacksilver hoards of the late empire, and of course there was a big conference held in Edinburgh a few years ago, and the Trap-Brain Law treasures has been found. I just wonder, it's a matter of finding it, the Trap-Brain Law treasure is very large. Is there a possibility that that some late Roman silver discovered, known about, was used, and would that change some of your statistics?
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. I think it's very unlikely. I mean, we've gone, since late Roman silver, we've gone through periods of no silver at all, like no silver coinages in Anglo-Saxon England, very little silver in Scandinavia, and then there seems to be a new source discovered that comes into play, and that allows the Anglo-Saxons and the Carolingians to mint silver coinage anew. So for Roman silver to have made a contribution, it would have to kind of be preserved in some way but not used throughout that period when there is no silver, and then to come up again in the Viking Age.
I mean, discovery during the Viking Age, not that it had been used in the meantime, but that somehow, if large hoards like Trap-Brain were discovered, and the material you were looking at was actually the product of something like the Trap-Brain Law, and there are other finds as well, whether that would change in any way, and Roman silver came from a variety of sources, some of them from the east, but it's just, I just wondered whether some of this just could, as a possibility, be something to take into account.
I think that could have happened. I think the Vikings would have used any silver that they came across. Our results are very consistent. We don't tend to get anything outside of our reference data. And I would imagine if we did have that, then we might see something that we couldn't explain, or that, that was off our... we did look at kind of sources in Spain and other areas where we thought Roman silver might be coming from, and it's very different to the data I presented here. So I think we might see something that looks unusual if that were the case, and so far we haven't seen that. But nonetheless, I think it's perfectly possible.
I'd like to follow up, Martin, and say thank you for a very clear and fascinating presentation of all your data. One thing that struck me is, historically, I've thought in terms of the silver that came from the east being the Swedish Vikings and the raids on Britain and Ireland being Norwegian or Danish, but yet you're saying you've got a lot of eastern silver coming to the west. And can you, disabuse me of my prejudices from the past, or, what was going on in that way?
Yeah, and I think it is mostly Swedish Vikings that are going eastwards. I think they are the main actors there, that they've become the Rus, and that they are responsible for bringing bringing dirhams back to Scandinavia. But it's clear that these dirhams then are diffused throughout Scandinavia. There are quite strong links between Gotland and Denmark in artifact types, a link that I think isn't really recognised so far in the literature. So I think a lot goes to southern Scandinavia, and I certainly see England as having very close ties to Denmark in particular. So I don't think you're wrong that it's Danish Vikings who go to England and they're bringing their silver with them. That silver came from Gotland, the Baltic. So I think that still holds. If we look at the distribution of extant dirhams, it's overwhelmingly Sweden, especially Gotland, then Denmark, and just a few in Norway. And Norway's where we're going next, and that will be interesting to see. But I don't think you're wrong, no. I think that still holds. It's just that the silver diffuses.
Yes, all fascinating, particularly, I think, because of my ignorance. And one of my areas of ignorance is, I've now forgotten the number. Did you say 7 million Carolingian pennies? What is the source that you think may now think is exaggerated that gives that figure, or what are the sources?
So that's an estimate by an esteemed medieval historian, based on all the sums that are given in the annals, the Continental annals, so the annals of Fulda, the annals of Saint-Bertin, kind of totaling those numbers up and arriving at that number.
So it's an aggregate of exaggerating monks that gives you that figure.
I mean, it hasn't been taken as an exaggeration so far. It's been taken as a sign that the impact of the Viking raids was grave, and that it was very profitable. But I think surely it seems a bit bizarre. Why would you emphasize that? You don't want to look like a weak leader, so why are you saying that the Vikings extracted so much money? So it's not intuitive, I think.
It may stress the kind of Babylonian captivity aspect of their lives, I don't know.
Yeah. Or it stresses the weakness of the person that went before you, or there's a kind of political thing going on there.
Yeah, thanks.
More questions? Yes, David.
Sorry, this probably reflects my misunderstanding. But it's the Bedale Horde in England you analysed. Why would you assume that was typical? Sorry, I should have said it was a really interesting talk, but perhaps I misunderstood why we should consider that as typical.
So we also analysed other material from England. We analysed a hoard from Bekermet in Cumbria, and it's just the same. So it has the same predominantly Islamic, a little bit of Western silver. So it looks like that northern, and again, it's kind of, there's a whole lot of hoards from northern England, all deposited between 900 and 925, roughly. And since those two hoards were the same, it looks like those are representative of silver there.
They borrowed it, I assume, this method of smelting where they mix lead to purify the silver. How did the Vikings know about that?
It's a very it's a kind of long-established historical method. They're very sophisticated silversmiths, I think, and they knew this method, and they took care to create silver to certain finenesses depending on its function.
Yeah. Why do you think some of these Islamic coins are left whole? They took so many of them that, you know, there's just bound to be a few, is that?
Yeah, and why melt down Carolingian coins apparently preferentially to Islamic silver?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's something about developing a certain mentality when it comes to coins. If you're used to treating silver as bullion, you might just treat it as bullion, even if it's in coin form to start with. As time goes on and you get more used to coins as coins, you might start to keep them in that form. And then they become useful as small bits of metal that have a currency function, even as bullion, not as coins as such. So I think it takes them a few generations to develop that coin mentality.
Right.
And to stop just melting it down and to start keeping them in the form that they arrived.
Do you mind me asking you something that doesn't really have to do with what you were... I wanted to know about the markings, the stamps on the ingots and the bracelets and things like that. I mean, there's a variety of these in the Bedale Horde you showed. We could see these. And what is there any significance to those, or are they to do with sort of ownership, or is there even a hypothesis about it?
There are some marks on ingots. For instance, there are cross marks on some ingots from the Bedale Horde, and you see it in Galloway as well. It looks like they're applied, it looks like it's a kind of something that you see in the Irish Sea.
Can we go back a couple of images just to...
I'm not sure if you'll see them on this. That's
yeah,
Galloway.
I mean,
you mean...
I really, yeah, I was looking at that. It's that
You
one
mean
from
this
the Galloway.
yeah.
Yeah, all those, I mean, they're decorative, some of those.
They're decorative, yeah. And yeah, it's a style that originates in Denmark and that comes over to the Irish Sea region, and they're kind of lines of stamps. They're applied in a very methodical way with a central cross.
Decorative, they like it, I think.
Very nice.
Has anybody else got a question for Jane, Dr. Kershaw? Yes.
We've talked a lot about what happens to the silver once we've got it, but not a lot about where it was mined from. You had a map with some mining sites, but sort of how does it get from those mining sites, which are all over, to places like the places that make the dirhams?
Yeah, so in the case of the Islamic Empire, some mines are located really close to mints. Indeed, some mines are mints, and on the coins they'll say Madan Tugda or something. So it's naming the mine on the coin. So in some cases there's a very close connection. But in other cases, like in Iraq, there are no local silver sources to the mint. So the silver is going to have to travel from the mine to the mint. Probably, so Baghdad, which is the major mint, has to get silver, we think, from the Taurus Mountains, and that will travel probably in ingot form because there are references to ingots at mines. So they're probably traveling down the Tigris or Euphrates rivers to Baghdad, and they're then being used at the mint. And that seems to happen, but it's a regional basis, so these silver doesn't have to be shipped across the whole caliphate. There's always a regional base. So that's the case in the Islamic Empire. And I didn't talk about the sources of wealth for the sources of the Western silver. It's thought that a lot of silver comes from Mel, which is a major mine in Aquitaine in France. That's the case for Carolingian coinage. But we can tell that that doesn't give the whole story because there's Carolingian coinage that doesn't match Mel. And we're not really sure where that comes from. Possibly there are mines in Germany that haven't been identified yet. But that's an open question. And the biggest question, though, is Anglo-Saxon silver. There's overlap with Carolingian coins, but it's not exactly the same. And even the alloys are different. And it's always been assumed that Anglo-Saxon silver is made of silver that comes over from the continent and is reminted into local coinage, but that's not the case. But I don't know where it comes from because it also doesn't match English lead. So it's not a source in England, and silver yields in English lead mines are very low, so they're probably not mining for silver in England. So I suspect it's a mix of different things which has been homogenized over the years to arrive at, they're fairly consistent, but what the silver is, I'm not sure.
Right, thank you very much indeed. I think the question is enough. Before I ask you to thank Jane Kershaw again, I'll remind you that the next meeting, the next lecture is on the 1st of March, and it's called Digging for Medieval Seals, Does Gender Matter? And it's to be given by Dr. Jitske Jasperse. Okay? And so for those of you who are looking forward to hearing about that, that's what the topic will be. If we could thank Jane, Dr. Kershaw again.